Hello and welcome to Liberty Law Talk. I'm your host, Richard Reinsch. Liberty Law Talk is featured at the online journal Law and Liberty, which is available at lawliberty.org. Today we're talking with Helen Dale about the current status of Brexit in the United Kingdom. Helen Dale read law at Oxford and Edinburgh. She's a novelist. Her first novel won the Miles Franklin Award in Australia. Her most recent novel, Kingdom of the Wicked, has been shortlisted for the Prometheus Prize for Science Fiction. She's a widely known commentator on law and politics and policy in the United Kingdom. She's written for The Spectator, The Australian, Standpoint, and Quillette. And she also has been writing for the past few months for Law and Liberty, primarily on Brexit. Helen Dale, glad to have you on the podcast.
Hello, Richard. How are you?
Great. Well, it's wonderful to talk to you. Your pieces on Brexit have been well received and widely read. I think here we are taping this on the morning of Friday, October the 25th. This will probably be released to our readers and listeners early in the next week. Currently, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, latest move has been to call for elections, and a vote will be taken likely on Monday. There is also the status of the European Union considering an extension to the October 31st deadline for Brexit. We don't yet know how long that extension will be or even if one will be given. So with all of that, that's sort of a newsy take on where things stand. Helen Dale, where do you think things stand?
We've got a situation where Boris Johnson has an in-principle agreement to his deal, and that was significant. And he also has an in-principle parliamentary agreement with the Queen's Speech, which is the legislative programme that he wants to enact going forward. Although in both cases, everyone acknowledges that a significant legislative programme like the one that was set out in the Queen's Speech probably does need to go to the electorate, because it's a large shift from what Theresa May was doing as Prime Minister. So that's sort of the normal pattern of British politics going on in the background. And I must admit I was quite surprised when Boris got the numbers for the Queen's Speech, which is the legislative programme, in the absence of an election. And that made me aware when I saw that a lot of people are very ambivalent. The opposition parties are very ambivalent about holding an election and very divided about having an election.
No.
At the moment, to me, it seems that this is largely because Boris and the Conservatives have opened a commanding lead in the polls. It's double digits for every pollster.
No.
You were going to say something, sorry.
Yes, no, just asking you, what are the fine points of Boris Johnson's deal that he has negotiated with the European Union that would avoid this so-called no-deal Brexit we hear so much about?
Well, the no-deal Brexit, or no deal, is actually the legal default.
Yeah.
That would happen, to use an expression, and I think you have this in the US as well, by operation of law, if something isn't put in its way.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Theresa May negotiated a deal with the European Union in somewhat unfortunate circumstances, triggered Article 50 too soon, allowed herself to be treated, instead of as a nation-state negotiation, it turned into a rest of the member state negotiation, which put Britain into a much weaker position, and came back with something that was not as terrible as people said it was, but was just a mess of contradictions. And the two largest ones were the backstop, which could not be time limited in Northern Ireland. And the other one was, because the backstop could not be time limited, was the continuing involvement of the European Court of Justice, which is the European Union's superior appellate court, in UK affairs after Brexit had happened. And this is never going to be acceptable to a lot of people. It wasn't just the ERG, it was unacceptable to the Democratic Unionists in Northern Ireland, it was unacceptable to significant parts of Labour. It just wasn't going to work. It was continually rejected. So then it looked like, when that happened, that no deal would happen by default. The thing that no one expected, or very few people expected, I must admit, I've been wrong a lot in my Brexit predictions. I'll be the first person to admit it. But I did think that with sufficient force of will and a better negotiating team, that the European Union would actually open up the treaty and redraft significant parts of it, but they would really need to be pushed. And the pushing for me was not necessarily something that would come from the presence of no deal, because I actually don't think no deal is as cataclysmic as people think it is on either side, for the European Union or the UK. We can come back to that later. I mean, there are problems with it. It's not a walk in the park, but it has been catastrophised on both sides, that it'll destroy British agriculture and destroy German car manufacturing and all of this kind of thing. The catastrophising has existed on both sides, and I think it's wrong and inaccurate. But so what you finished up with no deal looked more likely, and there was this constant refrain that the European Union will not change the withdrawal agreement. And I thought, no, if you put a sufficiently focused team of negotiators in front of who actually know how to negotiate these kinds of trade-based arrangements, even though it's a very preliminary trade-based arrangement, then the EU will open the withdrawal agreement and they will change it. And that's precisely what happened. And a lot of people were quite shocked by this. And I remember some of them took that shock with greater dignity and grace than others. Rory Stewart, who was a big opponent of Boris's all the way through all of this, he just put out on when the EU basically rewrote the withdrawal agreement. Rory Stewart just tweeted, "I was wrong." And credit to him for that. A lot of other people fudged all around it. Now, the big differences between May's deal and Boris's deal, the biggest difference of all is just that Boris's deal is much skinnier. It's a smaller withdrawal agreement. Smaller as in a physically shorter document, fewer pages.
Okay.
And the reason for that is significant chunks of what was originally in the withdrawal agreement, which is, remember, an international treaty that can't be changed, the actual treaty document, can't be changed without the agreement of both sides. Obviously, this is how international law works. This is how the Vienna Convention on the law of treaties works. So that appeared not to be changed. And then the political declaration, which is aspirational for what the future relationship will be, but was always drafted in the knowledge that a current parliament can't bind a future parliament in the United Kingdom. So the political declaration, separate from the treaty, realistically has no effect, or very little effect. What has happened is that a lot of the most contentious stuff in the withdrawal agreement that was in the treaty has actually been edited out of it, and it's just been dumped word for word. The phrasing is exactly the same, but it's been put in the political declaration, which means it cannot have the effect of binding a future parliament.
Okay.
And so that's the largest difference. And I'll just give you one example. You can get it off the House of Commons website, but I'll just give you one example. The Common Rule Book, which the European Court of Justice is going to have the power to enforce on the UK, despite the fact that the UK will have, sorry about all the conditionals here, will have left the European Union. The Common Rule Book has now been put in the political declaration and it's not in the withdrawal agreement, which means that no future UK government has to pay any attention to it at all. They might do, they might not, but that will be up to the elected government.
So what about the crucial issue that I read so much about was the Irish backstop, which apparently is interesting to me. No one seemed to really think about it during the Brexit campaign, and then it became this major issue about a year in post-Brexit, from my read of things.
Yeah.
And that became this major problem that Theresa May, although I've read she allowed herself to get pulled into it, but how does Boris's plan deal with that?
Well, basically what he's done is got rid of the backstop. The backstop is gone. The backstop was designed to impose a customs relationship on Northern Ireland if no agreement could be reached between the rest of the United Kingdom and the European Union. So that was the backstop. And the crucial thing is it wasn't time limited and the United Kingdom couldn't leave unilaterally.
Right.
Now, which of course you technically really shouldn't do in a treaty. I mean, the reason the European Union gets away with doing stuff like this to sovereign nations is precisely because the European Union, the international law that is the substratum of the European Union, is different from other forms of international law in that it has a sovereign, it can be enforced, it has enforcement mechanisms. I mean, to give you an example, supposedly the United Nations is international law and has enforcement mechanisms, and large numbers of US states, the entire country of Canada and South Africa, and quite a few others around the world have just decided to legalise cannabis, despite the drug control treaties as part of the United Nations. That's what most international law is like. It's relatively easy to ignore, not take seriously, whether it's human rights, whether it's drug control treaties, where even the World Trade Organization, you can get countries that have historically, like Argentina, just refused to pay the bills and just said block off, basically. It's surprisingly difficult to make international law stick because it lacks a sovereign. The European Union's got a very strong sovereign, and that's what makes it different from other forms of international law. So what has changed with the backstop is it's gone, and the customs arrangement that has been developed, which isn't really a customs arrangement, it's kind of an interesting fudge, is now subject, first of all, it's separate from anything that happens in the rest of the UK, and is now subject to approval by a simple majority in Stormont, which is the devolved Parliament of Northern Ireland.
Okay.
And the arrangements that are made, they can do the internal running of them, the mechanisms and so on and so forth. And it's actually quite a neat solution. It's a lot shorter than what was there beforehand. The danger with it, and you always have to be careful whenever you're dealing with Northern Ireland, and you're quite right to say that people did not think enough about Northern Ireland during the Brexit process itself. Lots of attention was paid to Scotland because they just had a independence referendum where it was kind of the opposite of Brexit, in that the yes-leave vote lost, but not by a huge amount, and the remain in the United Kingdom vote won, but not by a huge amount. The margin was wider. It was 55 to 45 rather than 52 to 48, but still you're dealing with a very significant chunk of people in Scotland who wanted to leave the UK. So lots of attention was paid to the Scottish situation during the debate in 2016 leading up to the referendum. Nobody paid any attention, or very few people paid attention to the situation in Ireland, which is actually much more delicate.
Yeah.
Because the reason why the DUP, even though in many respects what Boris has negotiated is better than what May got for them, particularly in terms of their ability to do the sort of think Belfast turning itself into Singapore type thing and making lots of money out of it, is that the Good Friday Agreement, which everybody forgot existed, which is quite remarkable considering how many thousands of people died during the Troubles. The Good Friday Agreement uses what's known as consociation, the same as exists in Lebanon, because in order to get peaceful governance of a community that's divided in a sectarian way, in this case, historically by religion, Catholics and Protestants, although that's kind of gone now, but it's still quite badly divided. And consociation, the way consociation works, is that you have to get agreement from both sides to something which means one side, whether it's the Catholic side or the Protestant side, and I'll use that as a shorthand for American listeners, can scupper the whole arrangement.
Mm.
Now, the Northern Irish problem has been solved by Boris, but he's dropped the Good Friday Agreement consociation element. That is the bit that says both nationalists who are historically Catholic now are more kind of social democrat, but the nationalists and the unionists who are historically Protestant and probably still are, they're a bit more religious than the Catholics, they have lost their ability that they had under the Good Friday Agreement to scupper a piece of legislation. And it is now going to be decided by simple majority in the devolved parliament in Northern Ireland, which makes sense to the rest of us because we live in democracies. We're used to simple majorities in our parliaments and Congress and so on and so forth. This is quite normal. But it's very unusual in the Northern Irish context because Northern Ireland had that consociation model, the idea being that you couldn't shaft the nationalists or the unionists without shafting yourself. That's why people come up with that kind of arrangement in a society that's got very, very bad sectarian divisions. They're very angry that that's been taken from them because they perceive, I think rightly, because the Republic of Ireland is much more prosperous than Northern Ireland. They perceive that it will exercise a centripetal force on Northern Ireland that means eventually it will become part of the Republic of Ireland and cease to become part of the United Kingdom. It is perceived, I don't know whether this is true, then there might be something in it, it is perceived that it will lead to a united Ireland and the breakup of the Union.
Under Boris's withdrawal agreement.
Yes.
Okay.
This is why they're refusing to vote for it.
So let me ask you, just trying to link this into the broader picture here. So the situation Boris Johnson faces then is members of his coalition from Northern Ireland, the Democratic Unionist Party, or the DUP, refuse to support him, but yet he's got majority support for the withdrawal bill, but he doesn't have support for his October 31st timetable, which has led him he doesn't. And the solution that he wants is new elections so he can assemble a new majority and push it through.
Well, yes, and the Tory party is itself deeply divided over what is the best thing to do. Try to use the fact that there's at least a notional majority to guide the withdrawal agreement that he's got from the EU, the renegotiated withdrawal agreement, through the Parliament and get Brexit out of the way first and then go to an election. Or the other one is that if Parliament is just going to continue to be intransigent and not do anything, because that's the main thing, is there's no positive vision from Parliament when it comes to legislation. It's all negative, and I don't mean negative, sometimes negativity, think of the concept of negative rights as opposed to positive rights. Sometimes negative things can be better. But I mean negative in the sort of playground sense of, nah, we don't want to. Very, very juvenile. A lot of this is very juvenile behaviour, and sort of the more thoughtful people in the Remain side are aware of this and are aware this is contributing to the increasing the growth of that poll lead that the Conservatives are enjoying, which is a combination of astute strategizing from Dominic Cummings, who is good at what he does, but the bulk of it, I admit, people are sort of treating Dominic Cummings as some sort of wizard. And whilst, yes, he's very able and very talented and very clever, he does have Boris Johnson to work with, who is probably the most popular politician in the United Kingdom. Douglas Murray, the commentator who for the Spectator over here, says, the thing with Boris Johnson is that he's one of those people who he can walk into a room and everybody just left.
Yes.
And that is a very rare trait to have. I understand in an American context,
particularly for a conservative
this.
politician to have. Yeah.
Yes, I understand in an American context that Bill Clinton could do this.
He could.
Just make everybody feel better about themselves. But yeah.
So I've been told. So it does seem the case that Boris Johnson has a legitimate argument here, that he has delivered it. He has put forward a better deal than May had. So the option, her option is gone, but we knew that. The no deal doesn't have to happen. He's got a good option here. He's got a majority in Parliament against him, yet they refuse to take responsibility and either go to the polls or pick a new leader and exercise some responsibility here, but want to just endlessly pick at him and delay what he wants to do. And it seems to me that's got to be breaking through in public opinion.
Yes, well, what I think the strategy, I'm not sure that the Lib Dems and the SNP have a strategy, so to speak. They've been a bit silly, but I think Labour has a strategy here. The rationale is that by forcing the government to break its promise about leaving formally, with or without a deal, on the 31st of October, I think the Labour Bengali, Shunas Milne, who's every bit as clever as Dominic Cummings, but obviously on the other side of the aisle.
Has Jeremy Corbyn to work with.
But has Jeremy Corbyn to work with, which can be good and can be bad.
Okay.
But Milne is thinks, and I can see why he thinks this, but this is an experiment. We won't know until the day arrives what will happen, is that once the 31st of October ticks over and Brexit hasn't happened, that Boris will take a hit in the polls exactly the same way that Theresa May did when the 31st of March earlier this year, 2019 date passed.
Yeah.
Tories took a massive hit in the polls at that. And if I were Bengali, I mean, I have worked for a politician, but in totally different circumstances, that would make sense to me. All right, let's see if he can keep this enormous double-digit poll lead after he's just broken a signature promise to the electorate.
Yeah.
Now,
but with May, we really had a sense that she had engineered her own demise. Not so with Johnson, I think. But that's just my American perspective.
It's just an enormous difference between the way the electorate responds to the two people. And you've tried, there's been this silly attempt to try to say, oh, the reason people didn't respond well to Theresa May was because she's a woman and so on and so forth. And that just makes me very annoyed, because Margaret Thatcher had the same thing that Boris has, which is the ability to walk into a room and everybody left.
Mm-hmm.
She had that as well. So it's not gendered. It's nothing to do with the sex of the people involved. It's to do with the personalities of the people involved. And too often, I think we forget that politics can be so personal. And in fact, I saw a comment from a Remain advocate, but a very smart and thoughtful one, Ian McWhirter, who writes for in the Scottish press, particularly the Herald up in Scotland. He made the point that while he was watching this happen, was that a lot of the people who voted for the Letwin fudge and delay to make Boris's life difficult on that Saturday sitting, Ian McWhirter, this Scottish journalist, just went through them all, name by name. And he said, every single one of these people, including Letwin himself, actually supports Boris's deal. They are doing this purely out of pique, and that was the expression he used. The old-fashioned, it's a pique.
Mm-hmm.
You're Boris Johnson, and you're more popular than me, and I'm going to do this just to make your life shitty and miserable.
Yeah.
And I didn't see anybody else make that observation, but I thought Ian McWhirter was pretty spot on when he said that. It was very perceptive. Now, obviously, he's a Remain person, but a lot of people who voted Remain accepted the result in the referendum, but they do want a deal. And so seeing a deal that had somehow magically, a lot of, as I said, people did not expect it, seeing a deal that has somehow been negotiated and is better than the previous one, even then people who voted Remain are seeing these antics and going, this is getting very silly and it's not helpful. But the strategic reason for why the silly, unhelpful behaviour is going on is because I think legitimately, whether it turns out to be true or not, is that Labour's strategists think that if it goes past that 31st of October, then Boris' big lead in the polls may partly or even wholly evaporate. We don't know. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating.
Let me back out for a minute. A more philosophical question for you. In the United States, at least in conservative circles, there's an essay by writer Christopher Caldwell, who's covered Europe extensively for various publications, and he wrote for the Financial Times a column for a number of years. And the essay appears in the current Claremont Review of Books, and the title is "Why Hasn't Brexit Happened?" His analysis is that Britain's entry into the European Union slowly altered the unwritten English constitution and created a strong group of elites within Britain in favor of this new altered arrangement. And they have done everything possible to stop the eviction notice that the British people rendered in 2016 when they voted for Brexit. And that ultimately this is not because of it's been bungled or badly managed, although we can say maybe that happened under May in certain respects, but that a strong group of important people in Britain, like the New Britain, see themselves as more loyal to the European Union and are doing everything they can to stop this from happening. What do you say?
I'm always the first point, that the changing the constitutional architecture point, is undoubtedly true. And this point was made to me when I was at Oxford, because Vernon Bogdanor was one of my tutors. And he pointed out that it wasn't just him, it's a point that's been made by a number of distinguished constitutional lawyers, whether they voted Leave or Remain or if they've kept stum and not said anything to anyone, because a lot of them have done that too, is that you finished up with a situation with two sovereigns. You know, Parliament is meant to be sovereign, or the Crown in Parliament is meant before the Supreme Court ruling.
Now we know it's the Crown and Court in Parliament. Sorry. Yeah.
Yes, but even then, even with the Crown and Court in Parliament, which is closer to the American model of a superior constitutional court, even then, if you take that as a given, we've got a situation where neither the British courts nor our Parliament, all the while we remain a member of the European Union, can substantially change significant parts of the law to which the European Union subjects all member states. So that law can't simply be repealed or greatly amended or so on and so forth. And that creates a situation, and this is always causes a constitutional, not necessarily a calamity or crisis, but it causes constitutional difficulties, because you can't find in that Kelsen term, you can't locate the Grundnorm of your country's constitutional order. You don't know where it is. You know, it's much easier to say my country's constitutional order, the sovereign is the Crown in Parliament, or the Crown and Courts in Parliament, or the combination of the three branches in the United States. Yeah, those are nice, clear answers that you can just get in a sentence. At the moment, the United Kingdom can't do that. So Christopher Caldwell's point on changing the constitutional architecture is absolutely correct, and has been boiling for a long time, and is why Vernon Bogdanor maintained there should be a referendum in 1993 for Maastricht, because of this constitutional difficulty.
What happened? The Maastricht moment. Explain that for our listeners.
Okay, and one of my pieces for Law and Liberty goes into this. What happened in Maastricht? Lots of things happened, but you only need to remember two of them. Powers that had formerly been wholly in the hands of the Parliament of the United Kingdom, of immigration and trade, were given away, ceded to the European Union without there being consent from the electorate in the form of a general election or a referendum to give those powers to the European Union. The way the constitutional architecture of the United Kingdom works is that authority is delegated to representatives who reflect it back to the people who elected them. That's the Burkean bit, the representative part, but the authority itself is delegated. This sounds like agency law. That delegate cannot then delegate the power further to another authority without the permission of the people, either in the form of a general election or a referendum. Now, Vernon Bogdanor said that it had to be a referendum question because it would just become too muddled in the context of a general election. And in the end, John Major just made it a confidence vote. So it went through the Parliament in the normal way on a division, the ayes and the no lobbies. And the really bad rot, according to Vernon Bogdanor, started there. Some of the other things about the European Union you can argue back and forth, and people do, and a lot of the Labour leaders, the traditional people like Tony Benn and Peter Shaw, always said that I don't like where this European Union is leading because I think it will make it impossible to ever have a socialist government. They were making a different sort of argument.
Yeah.
Vernon Bogdanor is not a socialist, and he wasn't making that argument.
Now this is Jeremy Corbyn. This is Jeremy Corbyn also, and his sort of.
Yes. Look.
I think you and I would agree. He's actually really in favor of Brexit. He just can't say it. But he said it in the past because he needs a nation.
Very much so in the past. During the referendum campaign, it was very amusing. Basically, one of the organisations that was supporting Leave, and I think it might have been a left-wing Leave organisation, not a right-wing Leave organisation, basically their entire output consisted of clips being shared on Facebook of Jeremy Corbyn bashing the EU from various speeches that he'd done over years. And that is literally all they shared. This young Jeremy Corbyn speaking in a very animated way about how much he hates the European Union.
Yeah.
And this is done quite deliberately because he was supposed to be campaigning for Remain, but I have to say I put campaigning in inverted commas because he did very, very little, very, very deliberately it's a running joke in Britain now that Jeremy Corbyn actually secretly in the privacy of the polling booth, he actually got his stubby little pencil out and voted for me.
Yeah.
So that first part of Corbyn's argument I agree with. The second one you were talking about was this elite argument.
Yeah.
That we've now got a social elite. This is where I'm not quite sure that this social elite point has actually anything to do with the European Union or with Brexit. What I think has happened is that both the European Union over a long period of time, going back to 1993, and perhaps earlier if you accept the Tony Benn, Peter Shaw, Jeremy Corbyn argument, but certainly going back to Maastricht in 1993, the vote itself was a catalyst, but a catalyst for things that this gentleman, based on your summary, because I've not read the article, is identifying with a form of elitism in Britain of a very particular type that's historically distinct from elitism that has existed in Britain in the past, bearing in mind, of course, in Britain you're always dealing with a class system. We have always had elites, sometimes even hereditary elites. You may recall your country had something of a annoyance with this characteristic and had a revolution about it and so on and so forth. So there's always been a class system here. There's always been social elites, and sometimes those social elites have bled into hereditary elites and back and forth. That's always existed. To give you a little sense of how old this problem is, Matthew Goodwin, a very fine politics professor at the University of Kent, did research where he mapped where historically there had been rebellion against the government of whatever sort, whether it was the monarchy, whether it was a local lord, whether it was the peasants' revolt or other revolts that have happened in the history, particularly of England. This is very much England. And laid it over the top of a density map showing the parts of the United Kingdom that had the highest votes for leave. And there was a 100 to 100 correlation between the places where there had historically been rebellions against rule, the authorities, going right back to the early Middle Ages, and a high leave vote in England. So this has.
But would you say? I take your point. I think Caldwell would add, or just from his essay, the position that the elite in Britain now, or at least a significant part, find themselves not exactly identifying with the sovereign United Kingdom, but actually with a continental European membership, and they actually don't want to see that lost, and so are willing and have been willing to do anything to stop Brexit from happening. That seems to me something that would play out if the Constitution's been altered. Then you've created new institutions, new incentives, and even a new identity for people under that arrangement.
This is identity, I think, is right. This is Professor Stephen Davies at the University of Manchester over here, who you know about because he also consults to the IEA. He is the one who says that there is now an actual Remainer identity out there.
Yeah.
And, in exactly these terms, there is this Remain identity. And these are the people who are doing things that are extraordinarily unusual for people who are middle or upper middle class Brits.
Yeah.
And this is what things like, I'm going to try to explain this and not sound like a twat, because it just sounds like the most awful class system otherwise. Basically, the people who turned up and were sober and dignified at Queen Mother's funeral came historically from one social class, and the people who turned up and threw masses of flowers on Lady Di's casket came from a different, and carried on and behaved in a much more emotional way than British people are traditionally expected to do in public, came from different social classes. And the people who behaved in a very controlled, unemotional, stiff upper lip way were overwhelmingly associated with the upper middle classes. The very emotional, open displays of patriotism, those kind of things were so you see the St. George flag in the window and the throwing the flowers on Lady Di's casket were overwhelmingly associated with people of a lower social class. And so you get this A, B, C, D, E system used in Britain. So the ABs were expected to be sort of constrained and well-behaved, and the CBEs were the ones who would go nuts at the football and set the stands on fire. Now, this is awfully shorthand. I'm trying to do British class 101 here. Now, what has happened is that people from that AB group, which the Remain vote overwhelmingly is, in England, Scotland, Northern Ireland is different, very different. But in England, you've got this situation where you've had people from that AB group going to marches with hundreds of thousands of people present, dressing up in costumes with the blue and gold EU stars and the colours, and with fancy hats and fancy placards and dancing in the street and carrying on in ways that you don't associate with that AB grouping. Now, obviously, it's not all of them. Obviously, one of the reasons why those Remain marches in London have been so big is because London is in the referendum, London was very pro-Remain, not as pro-Remain as Scotland, but still very pro-Remain. So so it's easier for them to get there, but even so, this behaviour is very striking and very untypical. And Stephen Davies, Professor Davies, calls it this Remainer identity, which did not exist in 2016. It's a new thing.
That's an interesting way to think about it. As I have watched this, and I've tried to follow it very closely, mostly through listening to the Spectator journalist and reading their accounts of things, as reading Standpoint and a lot of publications I'm sure you read and listen to as well. But I had the sense, particularly the latter few months of May's tenure, that Brexit could just be ignored. I thought that could actually happen, which I thought would be a disaster, and it would never be forgotten. But the power imbalance was such that it could be ignored. I no longer think that's going to happen.
I must admit, I did think that. I thought that for a bit there, and I actually put a couple of tweets out to the effect that there was this attempt to kill Brexit with, by the death of 1,000 cuts, and eventually it just wouldn't happen.
Yeah.
I think that's wrong. I think it will happen now.
Yeah.
But I think it's going to.
It really does seem the case that Boris has pushed it over the line, or is about to push it over the line, with a lot of people kicking and screaming.
It required someone with an immense personality, and political popularity to do it. It is just really, really hard, and I know people, and including many people who voted Remain, desperately want an election, because the Lib Dems particularly, they think that they will recover a lot of the seats that they lost as a result of going into coalition with the Tories. So a lot of people want an election, and it's very much people who don't want it are the ones who are actually currently in the House of Commons, because a lot of them have seats at risk. All three of the major parties have seats at risk. All from each other, and I think there's likely to be this election, when it does come, there will be a great sorting.
So,
and it might take another election quite quickly to need another sorting, so that we can sort of work out exactly where our politics are going to finish up as a result of Brexit. Because I do think Brexit is a catalyst for all sorts of other things.
What do you? You've said on Law and Liberty, in terms of the potentiality of Brexit to reshape British politics, that there's a majority around sort of social conservatism, as that would be defined in the United Kingdom, but also say some left-wing or populist fiscal taxation measures as well. Maybe talk about your thoughts on that, because I thought that was interesting. Clearly a Thatcherite conservatism, according to that analysis, no longer would be the dominant position, even in the Tory party.
Well, this is part of I don't know whether this is happening in other countries. People like Matthew Goodwin and Steve Davies and Kaz Mudd, I don't know how you say his name, Mudd or Mudde, the Dutch scholar. There's Steve Davies, Matthew Goodwin, Kaz Mudd, I'm sure I'm saying his name wrongly, I don't know how to say it.
I don't know.
And it's Dutch, so you sound every letter, so it would be Mudde or something, I suspect. And there's another one. But they've all been making versions of the realignment argument.
Okay.
And where they are all right on a particular point is, of the four quadrants that exist, politically, when you do that political compass test, the quadrant that has been underserviced for probably close to 40 years in the United Kingdom are people who are economically left-wing and socially right-wing. The group that everybody chased and wanted to get voting for them because they were such a crucial swing vote were, for a long time, were the classical liberals, which is people who were socially liberal and fiscally conservative. And they could do, even though we are a minority, people with that sort of orientation are a minority in every developed Western democracy. They are a reasonably large minority, and they tend to produce lots of wonks and people who are interested in politics and who go into it and who do something about it, up to and including producing in this country a Prime Minister in the form of Margaret Thatcher, who came from that tradition.
The same analysis holds in the United States as well.
So, but as part of this realignment, and it's worth reading Goodwin's book on national populism or Steve Davies' essay to the Cato Institute, where they both talk about this. And the Goodwin book is very cheap. You can get it. I mean, in America, you'll be able to get it for a tenner.
Yeah.
It'll cost you nothing. It's a little paperback.
We had a review of it on Law and Liberty by a British author, David Conway. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you're getting is a group that's been ignored quite a long time and hasn't been able to protect its interests because it hasn't traditionally engaged in civil society and political wonkery in the same way that classical liberals did in order to get our agenda. I mean, broadly speaking, I'm from the classical liberal wing of the Tory party. They have not been very good at that. But that doesn't mean that they're inert. They still have their ballots. And in 2016, they were able to use their ballots very effectively to make their voices heard. And I honestly, my suspicion is that because we've not listened to this group of people, and remember it's not all of Brexit, it's only about half of the Leave vote I'm talking about here, because we've not listened to people with this political orientation for quite a long time. One, they seem passing strange when you see their policy positions. People are just not used to seeing policy positions like that. They're shocked when they see it.
Well, elites are shocked.
And two, not just elites, everybody. I mean, because this political combination of political views, this is what I mean. You've got a situation where our political parties don't actually represent what's going on in the electorate anymore. A significant number of the people who are socially conservative but economically left-wing are in Labour and in the Tories. About the only party they're not in is the Lib Dems. There's even some of them in the SNP, the Scottish Nationalists. They call them the double leavers. Not only do they want an independent Scotland, but they also want to leave the European Union. And the double leavers and their vote.
I want someone to write on the double levers for Law and Liberty. That sounds interesting.
and of course, when polling data is aggregated from Scotland, where are all the double levers? They're in all the fishing communities, aren't they?
Okay.
All
that
around
makes sense,
Scotland. So this makes sense. So even the SNP is in a very awkward position because it's staked out a very strong pro-Remain position, but it knows it needs the double levers to vote yes in any future Indie rest, or otherwise there will be no Scottish independence.
Okay.
So all of the political parties have these people who are socially conservative, economically social democrat, I suppose you would call them. They're social democrats. And they've been underserved for 30 to 40 years. They are now making their voices heard for the first time in a long time, and their ideas are very distinctive, they're very challenging, and simply because the rest of us, regardless of our political tradition, whether it's left-wing or right-wing or civic nationalists like up in Scotland, we're all being forced to sit and listen to people articulate things that they want about the world and they want politics to do, that we've had this very cosy gentleman's agreement amongst everybody else. And I don't mean a conspiracy. I'm not into conspiracies. I'm a huge fan of always assume cock-up rather than conspiracy. But the rest of us are listening to these demands for the first time in a very long time. And it's challenging.
Yeah. Well,
I'll give you one little example of, I see this on social media. There was a complaint from a large agribusiness outfit, which I will not name because I consult in this area, so I wish to dog people in. But there was a complaint from a large agribusiness concern in this country that because of Brexit, fewer Eastern Europeans were coming under free movement to the UK, which is true. Their numbers have dramatically dropped. And they were worried that their fruit was going to rot in fields because there would be no one to pick it. And it was retweeted, this complaint, this whinge. It was retweeted by one of these people who has now become a sort of spokesperson for this combination of social conservative, economically social democrat voter group. Now, this gentleman who retweeted it and made this smart remark is in the Labour Party, but there are plenty of Tories who are like it too. And he just retweeted the whinge with, maybe you should pay British people better wages, then they'll pick your fruit, then it won't rot, then you'll be able to sell it, then you'll make money.
Yeah.
This tweet absolutely viral everywhere. So much so that the chap who did it, I don't think he quite realised what he started. It was one of those, it just went enormously. And that was just a little one I saw on Twitter. And I mean, government rests on the consent of the governed. And I actually am traditional enough, there's enough One Nation in me to know, traditional One Nation Tory, that you can't just tell roughly 30% of the electorate, that's about what you're dealing with, will know all of your ideas are wrong and you need to go away. And incidentally, before you go away, let me just tell you, you're a bad person before you go away. And imagine this said much more rudely, which I'm not going to do on your radio show.
That analysis roughly holds in the United States as well, between both the Republican and the Democratic parties, and particularly the elites in the parties. I'm probably not doing justice to both the scholarship of Matt Goodwin and Steve Davies, but both men have done a lot of work on this, and I do think that they're right. And you have got a big chunk of the electorate that's underserviced. And I don't know what Matt Goodwin's politics are. I know he voted Remain. He said that I reviewed his book for Quillette. And I did a brief interview with him beforehand just to find out a little bit about his background. And he said he voted Remain, but he was the sort of same argument as Ian McWhirter, my Scottish friend of the Herald Scotland, that, okay, we've had a vote, we now need to respect this result, otherwise we will finish up breaking things quite badly. And and also you've got to remember I will just, you mentioned it very briefly earlier, but I'll reiterate again, social conservatism in Britain is quite different from social conservatism in the United States. It's still very conservative, and in some ways it can be more conservative than American conservatism, but it is not conservatism based on religious values. So, for example, YouGov and Lord Ashcroft have polled these people, because we now know where they are because of the Brexit vote, and their majorities they're pro-choice, majorities in favour of same-sex marriage. So that's not the form of social conservatism. But they also want to bring back fox hunting. They just want no further immigration by any Muslim to the United Kingdom ever. Okay.
They don't care if it's, businesses complaining. There's been a lot of complaints about productivity over here because labour has been so cheap, low-skilled labour has been so cheap in large part because of free movement, that British industrial concerns particularly haven't invested in new equipment because they're doing that comparative advantage thing where human labour power hasn't lost its comparative advantage, and it's so cheap they can just hire more employees. Now that's running out of legs now, and they're now being told we have to hire British people and pay them more, which might actually increase productivity because suddenly the labour costs will go up, and then there'll be automation. There will be more investment in automation. Yeah. Maybe it may not happen. The reason it may not happen, and I'm saying this here, is because this is sort of one area where I jump off the classical liberal train a bit. I don't think, rather than phrasing it negatively, I think George Boyer, the American economist, is correct that low-skill immigration has exerts significant downward pressure on wages amongst low-skilled natives.
Yeah.
Now, he always based it on the merry old boat left, and people were going, oh, it's only Florida, and he'd have to segment the labour market to do that. It's really just a methodological dispute and so on and so forth, that the labour market still clears and all of those standard economic arguments. But the reason I think he's right is because he applied his analysis, obviously he's American, so he applied it to America. He looked at Florida.
Mm-hmm.
The country with the highest minimum wage in the world is Australia. It also has very, very low rates of unemployment, including low rates of unemployment amongst the low-skilled. Now, Australia makes it almost impossible for a low-skilled immigrant to get into the country. It takes vast numbers of immigrants, but almost none with low skills.
Okay.
It's been a deliberate exercise.
Similar to Canada's policy. Yeah, in a way, maybe.
The people at the bottom, sort of the bottom 20% of the labour market. And I've always thought, and I've known this, Australians know this, we know what exists in our own country, I've always thought you can continue to think that immigration doesn't have any effect on employment until you run up against reality. And the reality here is the giant unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Southern Ocean called Australia, where all your fine economic theorems are disproved, and even worse, they're disproved by an exercise in deliberate government policy, a centrally planned immigration system, which isn't supposed to work, but of course it does.
Yeah.
Now, that's me being all wonkish. I do wonkish things. But
that was excellent. A lot to think about. The book, I think you're referencing the American George Borjas, who teaches at Princeton.
I don't know how to say his name. It's B-O-R-J-A.
He's funny. He's actually Cuban.
Borjas?
He's Cuban. He came to America after Castro and has done, as you suggest, a lot of data on immigration and labor markets in the United States. And his current book, which encapsulates all these arguments, is We Wanted Workers, which I've read, and I also challenged a lot of what I thought as well. Helen Dale, thank you so much for coming on to tell us both the future of Brexit, where Brexit's going, and also deeper philosophical, political, and economic consequences. We thank you so much for your time.
That's okay, no problem.
This is Richard Reinsch. You've been listening to another episode of Liberty Law Talk, available at lawliberty.org.